Hello, welcome. We'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting today on the lands of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and to any First Nations people who are here with us today. I think it's appropriate that we're going to be discussing the future and forecasting on the country of the oldest continuing culture on Earth, where people have been imagining and creating the future for many tens of thousands of years. So it's really lovely and exciting, and thank you for being here. My name is David Finnigan. I'm a playwright and performer from Ngunnawal country in Canberra.
And my name's Jordan Prosser, and I'm a writer and director, a filmmaker.
Cool. And I'm Steph Winkler. I'm a cultural insight specialist or practitioner from Melbourne as well.
So thank you very much to the Wheeler Centre and Melbourne Knowledge Week for putting this on. Thank you very much for coming here. We don't have a moderator today. We're just winging it. So if this descends into a bit of
chaos,
shouting match, then you were warned. And so I think we're just going to begin by kind of introducing ourselves and talking a bit about our own practice and where we come from. So maybe, Steph, can we throw to you to start with?
Sure. Yeah, as I said, I'm Steph. I work in cultural insight, and a lot of people ask me what that is. It's really hard to explain at a dinner party in one quick sentence because it is a few things. But I suppose to tell you my background first, I spent very many years working sort of in the publishing industry, the youth publishing industry for Vice Media Group. Most recently as their head of insight for APAC. So I suppose translating trends and what we see, going on in culture into possible future sort of scenarios for brands that we worked with was one way of looking at it, and that's similar to the work that I now do with CrowdDNA. So CrowdDNA are a culturally charged strategic insight and research agency. So they're based all over the world: London, New York, Amsterdam, Singapore, and Sydney, and little old me in Melbourne. And so, yeah, I suppose my practice is quite similar there in that's what we do. We sort of use data and human insight to tell stories and help brands carve out a meaningful place in culture and to contribute to and build culture as well. And so, yeah, for me personally, as a practitioner, I do this across sort of several different disciplines or streams. So I work in signs, which is trends, and some would call it trend forecasting. In sort of culture at scale is another service that we offer at Crowd, which is sort of geared around social listening with structured and unstructured social data to track the conversation, and working with experts as well from all different disciplines all over the world to collaborate on projects like this, particularly very future forward ones. Then strategic insights, qualitative research, quantitative research through numbers, both research and validation of different trends, and content as well, so publishing and data storytelling. So there's a bit, and so that's why I don't talk about what I do at dinner parties.
I feel like, I want to ask lots more questions about that because this is all completely new to me. But maybe we should do a bit of an introduction to ourselves.
Please.
First of all. So I'm a playwright and theatre maker, originally from the world of, very much the world of theatre and live performance. But about 15 years ago, started making performances in collaboration with researchers and scientists. And so just under a decade ago, I did a Churchill Fellowship where I went to a few different places around the world and met with researchers who are working in the intersection between arts and futures thinking. So there are lots of these institutions who are kind of both futures researchers, but also folding that back into arts and what's sometimes called experiential futures. So in Hawaii in particular, the University of Hawaii has been a real kind of leader on that front. In Singapore, in China, in Hong Kong, in Europe and in the US. I met with a lot of people who are doing this whole idea of this scenaric planning, which we can talk a bit more about, there's scenarios and trends, the two different sort of wings of futures practice, but also groups doing what's called experiential futures. And that's a kind of catch-all term for a lot of different practices where creative designers and artists imagine elements of possible futures and then they make them here and now. And so sometimes that's storytelling, sometimes that's installation, sometimes that's creating literal imaginative artifacts from the future and then having them here and now and using them as a provocation to help us think about possible futures. So that idea of experiential futures is really fascinating. It's kind of led to some really interesting lines of work around the world. And yeah, when I came back from the Churchill Fellowship, kept thinking about it. And at a point, Jordan and I began work on a project not far from here at Carlton Connect. Yep.
So yeah, I've known David for years, but my work and my background was more in filmmaking and sort of in high concept genre filmmaking. And we'd done some other writing and work in the theatre space. And then in 2016, he asked if I wanted to work on a project with him, which was a big research piece based in the world of future studies. So everything I know, I basically learned from David. He sort of showed me the ways of that world and relayed a lot of what he'd learned on his fellowship. The reason I got into it and what excited me about it was, I guess it sounded like it had a lot of crossover with just good sci-fi and speculative fiction. It felt like future studies is kind of just a more scientific, maybe more data-driven way of world building. So that was what initially, drew me to the project. And the project itself, I guess I should talk about, is CrimeForce LoveTeam, which is the show that we're doing Wednesday, Thursday, Friday night at Melbourne Knowledge Week. And it's an interactive performance lecture of sorts that takes audiences through a sort of choose-your-own-adventure police procedural set in the year 2050. The work we did in 2016 at Carlton Connect, at the Lab 14 building on Swanson Street, was really just very, very research-driven, very research-focused. And the upshot of that was we kind of had a pilot script, I think it was, for without any funding or any idea how we would make 4 pilot episodes of a sci-fi cop drama, we nevertheless had these 4 pilot scripts that took place in 4 very different versions of Australia in the year 2050. And then shortly after that, we were approached by Nesta, which is an organization in the UK, and they run Future Fest, which is this really big sort of like, ideas festival, very similar to Melbourne Knowledge Week in the UK. And they approached us, and we thought, well, maybe we can take these pilot scripts and, I guess, turn them into live theatre and also gamify them in a way. David does a lot of work in game theory and builds these sorts of interactive shows. And so we took that concept and applied it to CrimeForce LoveTeam. And so the way it works now, essentially, is the audience makes a decision for us in the year 2021. And then the decision that they make ripples over the next 29 years and lands us in the year 2050. The story is a police procedural where these cops have to catch a killer, and depending on the decisions that are made now in 2021, there's only one version of a potential 2050 where that killer is caught. And so in doing that, you're sort of demonstrating, you're looking at that ripple effect and how the small decisions, whether it's in policy or in culture or in politics, that are made now, what the outcome is going to look like and what the future is going to look like.
So beautifully put, thank you. So I think the thing that's interesting and maybe is worth jumping off about that show and about what Steph has sort of flagged of her work so far is when we were making CrimeForce LoveTeam, one of the big things that we noticed, we were digging into all this research material. A lot of places produce future scenario reports. Like if you go online and hunt for them, you will find so many. Every big company produces them, every big corporation, governments produce them, all sorts of think tanks and other groups. But typically, they tend to sit in the realm of governments, companies. They talk about economic change, they talk about climate, they talk about political change. They maybe talk about social trends at the biggest possible scale, like demographic shifts. Will people be living more in cities or in the rural areas? How old will people be? What will population growth look like? But that's the sort of macro scale that they get into. And we were really interested in what does cultural change look like? Particularly, we thought, okay, let's do our project that looks at the future of pop culture, the future of youth culture. So we actually the show tracks a boy band in the year 2050. It's the story of a boy band. One of the members of the boy band gets murdered. We figured there's one thing that we can guarantee will still be here in 30 years. It is boy bands. They've been around for 100 years. They're not going anywhere anytime soon. So we were really interested in what will pop music sound like in the future? What's the future of that kind of cultural activity? And Steph, I know what you do is, you said your organization is culturally charged strategic and research insight. What does the culturally charged bit look like?
I suppose it's in the simplest way. It's taking clues from culture to build up to a sort of scenario plan for possibilities of what things could look like a few years into the future in some circumstances. So I suppose to define like a trend versus a scenario would be a good place to start there. So a trend is, in my view and by many definitions, sort of a sustained cultural or behavioural change that's taking place over a few years versus, say, a fad, which is kind of, comes and goes, it's a flash in the pan. And micro trends, which sort of begin in that sort of, couple of years, are often kind of culminate together to create more of like a macro trend or to indicate something that's happening, like a more sort of enduring shift in culture, which is the type of stuff you're talking about, like the 5 years, the 10 years, the 20 years sort of shifts that we can start to sort of plot against. And so, yeah, when we think about using trends to plan scenarios, we begin by looking at, the micro and the macro. There's sort of a four-step kind of process to this as well. We have many tools that we can use to pick up on trends and conversations as they're happening today, whether it's, again, working with our expert network or using social listening, tapping into our own sort of insights, repository, or using quant and qual tools as well to do that. Then it comes down to pinpointing sort of consumer tensions. So it might be, at the moment, we're seeing a lot of people grouped by either like progress or regress, whether they're kind of shifting towards new behaviours, new ideas, new sort of mindsets, or doubling down in sort of a protectionist mentality. So, plotting out a few of these things, creating a bit of an axis, and then coming up with some possible sort of scenarios that answer a question over a little time period that you've got there. And so it's a kind of art and science sort of merged, practice when it comes to that.
Can I ask, in terms of the data that you're actually drawing on, do you touch on more formal data sources like reports from think tanks and government policy, or is it more crowdsourced?
Yeah.
A mix of both?
Mix of both. So we are obviously a research agency. We conduct our own research, but where there's publicly available data like that, we certainly use that as well. So, usually it's like a sort of a landscaping phase at the start to bring in what we already know, and then we'll plot the gaps in the knowledge, and we'll kind of take that into consideration when designing our own research as well.
So that's trends. Scenarios, we have a particular definition of scenarios. Curious to see if it lines up with the way you use the word. These are all kind of slightly fuzzy terms, I suspect. But a scenario in our kind of understanding is a sort of an image of the future. It's a snapshot or a kind of a story about what the future, one version of what the future could look like. And instead of, I guess the crucial thing with scenarios is that you never just have one. You always create multiple different scenarios to compare and contrast.
Absolutely. There's no one future. So I guess coming down to, again, creating like quite a pointed question about what you're trying to find out, just saying what does the future look like, and trying to map that scenario with all of the different micro and macro factors is just not a very good way in. It might be like, okay, what has COVID-19's impact been on our experience of home or our needs of the home, for example? And we could go, okay, we're going to look at that over the next sort of 6 months, 12 months, 5 years, and again, taking into consideration what we know of the trends and the consumer behaviour shifts that we're seeing, we can sort of begin to plot some possible scenarios based on that.
I love
instead of concrete kind of predictions of a single, unified future, because that doesn't exist and it changes all the time.
The future doesn't exist,
Exactly
I love that you did this gesture, because I think we've got a real, in all of the work that we've done, all the futurists that we've spoken with, the researchers sort of come back and say, okay, there isn't one future. In fact, the future doesn't exist at all. We're not trying to predict the future. We're trying to use scenarios to help us be prepared for lots of different futures, but instead of
create a future that we want as well. This is the whole point. Particularly if we're taking on the voice of the of the consumer, and then hearing back what type of future they would like to create, what their values are, what matters to them, how their behaviours are shifting towards that. Then we can sort of help to play a role in creating that as well.
But all of these people have said they sort of say you could create any number of scenarios. If you're talking about what the future might look like in 5-10 years, you could create 50 different scenarios or 1,000, but most of the people that we've ever spoken with are like, oh, we tend to make 4. There tend to be 4. There are not one future, there is 4 different futures.
Four's the sweet spot, it's not too many.
But it's actually this kind of an axis, an x-axis and a y-axis, and a 1, 2, 3, 4. So I feel like I've seen people do this gesture in the world of futures so often.
Yeah, I guess it narrows it down from having a million different, that's exactly it. It's so open-ended, and when you've drilled it down to quite a pointed question, it's, usually the sort of practice to start with 4, but you can, of course, expand beyond that. You can, you can get more granular. You also, will be adapting and changing things as you get more information over time about how a scenario is unfolding. You'll be able to sort of update and rejig as you go along. So yeah,
we see it though. We see it all the time. Like once you start sort of seeing that 4 scenario thing, you'll see it. Like the IPCC scenarios for different climate futures. There's 4 of them that they'll create. If you see Josh Frydenberg doing a kind of budget scenario, you'll see a kind of trend forecast line, and you'll see 1, 2, 3, 4 possible scenarios. It just seems to be like where we can kind of come to. But that idea of the axis, can you talk a bit more about you kind of plotting things on 2 axes?
Yeah, I guess once we, I think I did a poor job of explaining this earlier, but once we have sort of the trends, the cultural signals, the behavioural shifts all kind of before us in a big pile, we'll go, okay, what does it mean? What does it mean for human behaviours? What does it mean for our needs, our values? And we can then start to pinpoint some tensions. So one apart from the progress regress side of things might be the shift away from thinking about me to thinking in a more community-minded way to we. So we can sort of start to pull out the tensions that we see, and then once we've got 2 that feel sort of salient for the the type of question we're answering and that seem like the most sort of common that pop up throughout this trend sort of landscaping process, that's how we build our axis. And then from there we have a bit of a framework to plot these scenarios against. But I'm interested in how you did your 50-year forecast for CrimeForce LoveTeam. What do those futures look like? Give me your process, and how did that come out the other side?
Well, I feel like a lot of this can be framed purely in terms of a time frame. Like I believe a lot of your work exists around the sort of 2 to 3 year time frame.
Yeah, when we're looking at sort of micro trends, and of course, all of them ladder up to sort of larger macro trends, which might be more on like a 10+ year trajectory. But they're obviously a lot broader. The micro trends that we identify, I usually have more of a lifespan of like a few years. So, but yeah, they're all kind of connected in that.
So luckily, thankfully for us, given that we're writers and not scientists or researchers per se, that I think the longer you look ahead, the greater creative license you can take, and it's more about finding sort of like one little kernel of truth in the present day and extrapolating that and sort of taking it in whatever direction you want to. So you can rest assured you always fall back on there is that kernel of truth, there is that research that informs the viewpoint you're taking, but you can still have fun with it. And so the reason we chose to make it a police procedural is because it's a very standard, very gripping, very reliable sort of narrative format. Basically, we based it on an episode of Law and Order. But the funny thing about like an episode of Law and Order is you also, like the detectives in the course of their investigation will actually run into so many different people from so many different facets of society. They might have like an encounter with, someone who's from the underworld, the criminal underworld, but then they'll kind of interrogate some high-class CEO. And so we were like, what better way to try and paint a really fully descriptive picture and actually fully sort of build this world than to try and check in with people from every different walk of life that we possibly could.
So those kind of, we were building these snapshots. There's a lot of creative license that we took, but actually there's 2050 in some ways is the easiest possible place to hook your futures onto, because everyone is putting their futures there. So when you're kind of like, you're doing the real work at the coalface, I think, whereas we're kind of just reading. Our main research practice was just to actually download and read these PDFs that every organization puts on their website and no one reads. And we probably are I don't know, one of the few people that actually bothered to read these things. But everyone is talking about 2050. Yeah. So there's heaps to sort of glom onto existing research. There's some big trends that are maybe a lot more locked in when you're looking at that time scale. We can make some really confident predictions about world population and potentially temperature, climate, that when you're talking about short-term trends, things move a lot in the short term. Things kind of really fly back and forth. Big, longer-term things, they've got a lot of momentum. The trends are a lot slower. So you can kind of actually be a bit more confident about some of those things. And like Jordan says, you're able to make things up at that remove, which is takes a lot of the pressure off. If you have a trend, I imagine if you do a sort of any forecasting activity for 2 years' time, then there comes that moment of reckoning in 24 months when you have to actually find out whether you were...
Well, this is the thing. But as I say, as you sort of gain, you can plot scenarios and you can, use the materials you have at your disposal to, map those trends, map those scenarios, see how things, you think are most likely going to look over a certain time frame. But as new information becomes more available, you can obviously build on those and become more detailed and all of that stuff. So. Again, it's sort of just the most probable scenarios based on the information we have at hand at that time is kind of where we take it from. But I guess my question as well in terms of, you called it experiential futures, right? And there's been some interesting stuff like that I've noticed in the last few years. So Dubai's just built a museum of the future where basically it's about, the ethos, I believe, is sort of about readying people for the future. So they'll be able to literally put themselves into, what an apartment building will look like, or what this, or, an office or whatever it might be, to sort of help to bring those probable scenarios to life a little bit better. I suppose, is that what CrimeForce LoveTeam kind of does as well, is like just getting people into the mindset of, putting them in those shoes. And
it's a beautiful example because actually the Museum of the Future, one of the kind of the lead people on that project is Noah Rayford, who we worked with early last year on a kind of set of scenarios that he and another kind of distributed group of futurists around the world had put together. The Special Circumstances Intelligence Unit kind of set of projects which... really fascinating kind of group of scenarios. But that Museum of the Future is kind of like the ultimate example because Superflux, which is the group that produced that apartment, the apartment in the year 2040, they've made basically a large installation that you can walk into and move around that's like a hypothetical what an apartment might look like in the year 2040, from the books to the shelves to the kind of food on the table. Superflux also... Really interestingly, they're a kind of design studio based in London, and they produce these sort of experiential designed objects for a very political purpose. They're very deliberately, they're not just for art's sake. They'll often pop up in museums, but really they're intended for government. And so part of that project was they produced for the Dubai government a set of canisters where they, based on different people's predictions of what the air quality in Dubai might be in the year 2040. They basically have a smell of what the city streets could smell like.
Could get very bleak very quickly.
But honestly, they were like nothing had made a faster difference. People opened this canister, had a smell, and we're like, you know what? Let's actually really talk about pollution. So that's where experiential futures, I think, it can be useful. They just make it so tactile and tangible.
That's where I see creativity playing a huge role in futurism. Is making it real, making it tangible. Like getting people in those shoes and figuring out solutions that they want to take themselves,
So speaking of creativity, one of the big things we've been chatting about in the kind of lead up to this event is obviously CrimeForce LoveTeam really centers around the future of music, but a lot of your work too looks at kind of future of music. So we wanted to kind of just have a little bit of a chat about the trends in that space, the kind of art and music trends, things that you're noticing or excited by.
Noticing and excited by, and in some cases a little terrified by as well. But I guess the big sort of things that have stuck out for me in terms of how we listen to and consume music and how music is made has sort of been in the last few years we've sort of seen this shift away from genre binaries, I suppose. I mean, just when you think about the way that we consume music, it's all through algorithmically generated recommendation engines. So it's Spotify, it's YouTube, whatever it is. Which means we're getting fed music from all across the spectrum. The way that young people particularly listen to music now is completely different to how we did, where we would buy an album, buy a band of a genre and listen the whole way through. So the music that's getting created now, particularly by younger generations, seems to sort of move away from that, that specific sort of genre, brackets. There's a lot of intersection, there's a lot of overlapping, there's a lot more experimentation. And there's a lot more collision there as well. So that's sort of one thing that we've seen going on the last few years. And then there's also been this absolutely enormous impact of TikTok. Like we're seeing the way that artists write their songs, they're getting shorter, they're having more sound bites that can be taken out and used for TikTok. Like that's sort of just across the board in pop music particularly.
Sean Monahan had that great line where he described, it's like each new technology or each new form of media kind of uses the previous form of media as the raw material. So in the way that early film used theatre as the raw material when they're making film, TikTok is using pop music as its raw material.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's not about the music, it's a whole other thing.
Exactly. And there's sort of this sort of dark lens on that, which is, you know, again, this could probably use a bit of a fact check, but based on something I read the other day, assuming it's true, there's this sort of nugget of info that I stumbled across, where basically now in China, where Douyin is the sort of TikTok master brand or equivalent over there, if a song is released through a record company and it doesn't go viral within 72 hours on Douyin, they'll pull the marketing budget. That's sort of becoming the trend.
Is that dark or is that great?
I think
really...
it's a bit dark.
Kind of accelerated natural selection for culture.
Everything should have more than 72 hours to
I don't know.
flourish. You know,
about,
like come
pop
on.
music on TikTok. I think.
And so the impact of that obviously is that more and more people are writing songs that, you know, hit that sort of you know, that particular sound, or that, you know, that way that music sort of is experienced on that platform. They're writing to that versus getting to sort of experimental, writing towards sort of an algorithm, I suppose.
And that is, in fairness, how we ended up with Old Town Road, which I think, you know, we can all be grateful for. That's a really
exactly.
TikTok-crafted masterpiece.
Exactly.
So
that's kind of the sort of the bigger conversations that I've been keeping my finger on the pulse on for the last little while.
Do you think the kind of the echo chamber effect, like the feedback loops you get because of algorithms, do you think that's going to make it easier or harder long term to forecast trends?
This is actually a really big sort of topic. So with what we see on Instagram and TikTok and all of that, obviously it's controlled by an algorithm. We are seeing sort of a bit of a rebellion against that. So for example, creators are now either moving on to different platforms. Music, the next sort of wave of music is coming out of Discord, you know, communities like gaming platform, you know, peer-to-peer sharing and peer-to-peer music creation and stuff like that. So there's been a bit of a rebellion against that. Creators are moving off Instagram because of the censorship, because of the algorithm, onto like Patreon, OnlyFans stuff. And also they can make money that way as well, where they can't on Instagram. So I think, it's people are not blind to the adverse effect that the algorithms can have, I suppose.
You were talking a bit about some of this sort of the music that was sort of coming out of the Discord community. You mentioned Digicore. Do you have a track that you think is worth having a listen to?
Off the top of my head, no. There's a playlist full of just...
I found the playlist and I brought it. So
Angelus?
Let's see.
Is the only one that's coming to mind at the moment?
Yep, here we go. All right.
But I guess like taking that, the way that the music's created, like peer-to-peer, knowledge sharing, creating it for, you know, a bunch of internet kids, using sounds from the internet, like inspired by that kind of sound and that kind of platform that they're using.
Every track on this playlist is less than 90 seconds long too, which I strongly endorse.
So without sitting here for 90 seconds and listening to the whole song, I think that's sort of one of the more interesting things that we've seen lately. It's a bit of a rebellion against that algorithm machine.
I don't know what to do. I see your text, but I don't really like you. Got me fucked up, I have to remind you.
I think it's great.
I mean, I don't know. I'm not here to pass judgment. Anyway,
We could listen to the whole song.
I'm really happy with that.
If we've got any time left at the end, we'll just play Digicore for 5 minutes.
We'll have a playlist of future tunes. One of the big sort of worlds that we've been looking into, kind of obviously in the boy band space, the K-pop has been the big. I mean, since the late '80s, really, K-pop's been kind of there. But the last 3 years has been the big breakthrough that people have been predicting since the '90s. And we were kind of fascinated by K-pop as this sort of absolute performative excellence of this one particular, like, if you want to talk about crafted and artificial pop music, what BTS is doing, and the bands like EXO, which is really, they're quite spectacular.
EXO, they have 12, or at least a few years ago, I know, they had 12 members, 6 Chinese and 6 Korean, and they would release albums simultaneously in 2 different languages. It's just savvy, completely owned, like, wholesale by these corporations, and the children are kind of like groomed from a very early age to just be star performers and go through a really, brutal selection process. Based on the probability of their success as a pop star.
Do you think we're going to see that more and more, like in terms of, you know, having like a bit of a, I guess, like, yeah, churning out these acts based on what we know people like, because, you know, algorithms also like certain types of music? Like, is that something that we should be keeping an eye out
I
for?
hope so. I really hope so. I mean, look, one of the big sort of trends when we're talking about axes and, like, you know, what's at sort of one end of the axis and what's at the other end, we sort of put K-pop at one end of the axis, and, you know, BTS and say Blackpink are absolutely at that far extreme of they're completely crafted. They've been trained since maybe not birth, but like from a very young age. They're completely owned. Their contracts are like incredibly fine-grained. They date who they're told. They appear where they're told. They're phenomenal dancers and singers and rappers, and they're beautiful-looking humans. So it's all completely artificial. And then at the other end of the spectrum, what we were sort of seeing in the same space is this move towards kind of authenticity with a capital A and like a real personal connection. You're never really going to get a personal connection with BTS. I mean, you can play the game. There is a digital game that they released for BTS where you get to take on one of the members of BTS where they leave the band and start their own strawberry farm. But that's as close as you're going to get to being a member of that band. Whereas groups like One Direction really traded hard on the authenticity, and they sold themselves as like, we don't dance. We're kind of like, you know, we're just all about the fans and their Twitter personalities. The kind of record company deliberately gave them this social media spaces so that they could have that real, genuine connection. Of course, that means they lose a degree of control. So just reading recently about, on TikTok, kind of influencers like Emma Chamberlain, who, like the whole kind of Visco Girl movement of like these influencers who are just kind of tracking their daily lives in the most banal and grueling detail, but have, you know, millions of followers. Or Charlie D'Amelio, who's the biggest TikTok influencer right now, I think has about 100 million followers, and has recently been starting like just burner accounts. So when she goes to an event, she went to the influencer boxing match last week, where Jake Paul, who's a YouTuber, fought some random guy. And Charlie D'Amelio started a burner account, just like a kind of Twitter egg type of account. No name, just user 19411 whatever. And fans found it. They found that she was releasing this thing. It was never promoted, but they kind of found their way to her. And she got 1 million followers in 24 hours on this throwaway account, with the idea being that this is the real unfiltered Charlie.
Yep.
So that sense of like, I think there is a real push and pull between, on the one hand, really crafted, controlled, artificial pop music, and then really like authentic, you've got the personal relationship with creator music.
Yeah.
Can I say on that though, it makes me think, just in terms of back to our broader point about how we kind of like go about imagining these future scenarios, is it's very much about identifying the variables, but it's also just as much, I think, about identifying like what the constants are going to be. Like any sort of experiment, is you have your controlled constants, and things like musicians and artists will always be, to some extent, screwed over by somebody, whether it's a corporation or whether it's a big tech or whether it's just like a record label. And in the same way, I think like music and artists and cultures, that will always be that push and pull between like, you know, sort of like corporatized and more authentic. So sometimes it's not about having to imagine that, it's just about imagining like the tools that are going to be there and then applying it to the same scenario, because those things, I think, you know, have always been around, and it's safe to say will always be around as well.
Yeah. I think one enduring thing about music and, you know, the way that people listen to it is that it does tie to like an emotional experience. It ties to something like values that we have that are bigger than ourselves, which is kind of driving these days. It's sort of what really underpins that like mega fandom that we see, right? Like, and that's why the authenticity thing is also, so important, is because we want to feel like we are making a genuine connection. We want to feel like we have a, you know, a two-way dialogue with the artists that we like, because we've grown up in a time where two-way dialogues with people anywhere is possible. So, yeah, I think that could be an interesting, enduring thing that will stick around long beyond any of these other like trends, is what music does and what we need.
Do you think those sort of kind of stan culture, those fan armies, is that trend sort of still kind of climbing, or do you think it's kind of peaked?
Definitely, yeah. It's
terrifying.
Massive source of like social and political and economic power as well. So we were talking earlier before we came on stage about K-pop fans who, you know, banded together. There's basically just power in numbers, right? And they've, you know, obviously people at large are starting to realise this. K-pop fans in particular, for example, just booked out an entire Trump rally so that nobody came, and that was all organised online, just as a bit of a stunt. But there's stuff like this happening all the time. There's fundraising and an altruistic sort of angle to this as well. BTS's fan group are extremely politically engaged, across many sort of conversations. So yeah, I think it's an interesting time, and it's only sort of gaining more power in the short to medium. Yeah,
we were saying before how odd it is in a way to see sort of like pop fan groups and fan culture being the more politically engaged and more politically motivated, where it's, I guess, traditionally something you would associate so much more with like counterculture and underground movements, but it's front and center mainstream now. And they'll book out a Trump rally so that no one goes, but then they'll also, often who's number one in the charts just has to do with who mobilized their fan base more effectively.
Absolutely.
And just, played a track on repeat for 24 hours a day across 10 million Spotify accounts, so it gets to number one. So it's kind of, they can do both.
Yep. Interesting times.
One of the other trends that we were sort of really closely tracking, and I don't know where we ended up coming to, whether it's a sort of real trend or whether it's kind of a side, like being sidetracked, but algorithmically generated music, which has been kind of like hyped for decades now. I think, algorithmically generated music is making its inroads. I think increasingly when you have your Spotify playlist set to ambient work music in the background, what you're hearing is probably not music that was composed by a real composer, or if it was, they were probably someone working for Spotify for a few cents an hour. But we started tracking those programs that are trying to take music and create real kind of approximations of pop music. One of the ones we wanted to share with you, just because it's really entertaining, OpenAI, which is a big research organization, have recently launched their kind of pop algorithm, their pop song algorithm. So it's a piece of software that they feed it pop music, and it will try to reproduce pop music or write new pop songs in the style of those artists. And so it's trying to determine what the algorithm thinks are the key qualities of that song or that artist, and then reproduce those in a new original composition. So they've got an amazing SoundCloud where they've just produced their version of like Celine Dion tracks or Eminem tracks. For a few of them, what they do was they'll play the algorithm 12 seconds of a song, and then they'll get the algorithm to finish the song based on what it sort of imagines the rest of it would be like, based on what that other artist's music has listened to. So this is the algorithm hearing the first 12 seconds of Shape of You, and then trying to write the rest of the song.
Isn't the bag of words and happy. What you love, I need to read your mind. Again and again, you're only complete. When I put you into
Wow.
Yeah. Oh my God. It's like if Shape of You didn't exist as an actual song, would you think that was just a normal song? If you didn't have the original to compare it to?
It's literally like an oral version of when AIs try to make paintings and they just come out really weird and psychedelic, and it is definitely art in its own right, but it's like...
It's in an artistic uncanny valley where you're kind of like, I know it's meant to be this, it's not quite.
Yeah.
Was it OpenAI who had the Jay-Z schmozzle as well?
Oh, no, that's a whole other thing. We haven't even talked about deepfakes.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, there was quite recently, someone on YouTube, someone put a couple of videos of Jay-Z rapping "To Be or Not to Be," and him rapping a Sesame Street track, and it just, you hear it and you're like, oh yeah, that's kind of funny. It's Jay-Z doing something silly and off the cuff. It's actually a deep fake. Jay-Z's team have sued the group making that deep fake, but also I think the end result, really fascinatingly, was they were like, well, we're not going to take it down, but Jay-Z just gets a cut now from whatever that deep fake Jay-Z does.
Right,
which is a real, like, we can't beat the algorithms, but we will collaborate and take a percentage.
Interesting. I'm just terrified of deepfakes and where that's all going in the future. But I guess from bouncing back from sort of trends back to sort of future forecasting, you were mentioning something earlier about these kind of pop-up communities that are starting to sort of venture into this space, right? Like it's not just, creatives like yourselves or sort of commercial practitioners like me. It's like everyday people are starting to sort of get more and more into this space.
Yeah, you were talking about the Future Today assignments.
Yeah, so they're sort of a futurology consultancy, but they do a lot of, they'll just sort of give weekly tasks. So if you're interested in this sort of stuff, you can go onto the Future Today Institute and go onto their sort of weekly challenges. And so they'll give you like a question or a provocation and say, okay, like it's good brain training, really. Okay, what does the future of transport look like in this country over the next 2 to 5 years? Here are some drivers or some trends, micro trends that should be considered as part of that. And then you can submit a small little paragraph or pitch about what you think is going to happen. And then, there's prizes to be won. You can win classes, you can win money, all that sort of stuff. So, it's fun to sort of dip your toe in and start to have a bit of a think about how these trends might actually start to impact on culture, if that's something of interest as well.
And maybe on the extreme end of that spectrum, there is super forecasting.
Well, it's still, super forecasting is still a community. But this is they're a really interesting group. Actually, the original writer, Phil Tetlock, has been around since the 80s. And he began in the early 80s doing this project where he started talking to newspaper columnists, like editorial columnists, and big name columnists too, in the New York Times, Washington Post, kind of usually American. But these big sort of political pundits who were writing columns. And he just started keeping track of the predictions that they made in their columns and just sort of seeing, are they accurate, are they not? And being like, coming back to them after a year or two. And then did that across all of the 80s and into the 90s. And the results, which kind of caused a bit of a stir when he published them in the early 90s, was that the leading columnists of the world are worse than useless. They're kind of worse than random. They get it wrong more often than they get it right. And these are people that, they have gigs now. So people since then have been tracking them. And there are people like Thomas Friedman, who's still a very famous and very successful New York Times columnist, who's been wrong consistently year after year for 30 or 40 years and draws a bigger paycheck than any of us will ever see. So Phil Tetlock was like, well, how can we do better than that? And he actually formed this group where he started saying, all right, well, let's take real questions about the world in the future and try and predict the answers. And those people that do better are going to do better in this sort of tournament, and those people that do worse are gonna be knocked out. And we'll actually see whether the future can be predicted. And it turns out that it kind of can, or at least a lot better than chance, a lot better than newspaper columnists. So they run a big tournament which is online and open and free, and you can jump in and take part. Where questions, I looked at some of the questions for today, right now that are open. They're questions like, will Scott Morrison cease to be Prime Minister of Australia before the 1st of September 2021? How many confirmed cases of COVID will Brazil report as of the 31st of July?
It's a pretty concrete,
Will the Republic of Chad cancel its elections this year? How many members of the Chinese state media will be imprisoned in 2021?
And so the idea is people would take a punt at answering that, and the most correct one wins?
That's right. So they and the people that win, this was really fascinating. They have a kind of score, a leaderboard. The more questions you answer correctly, the earlier you get them right, and that sort of thing is kind of a big feature of it. The number one scoring person in the world for a year or two was an ex-US general, like a 4-star general who had basically had all of the military contacts and all the political contacts and all of this political knowledge. And the number 2, who I think was just a couple of points behind him, was a housewife from Kansas City with 4 kids who just liked to read the papers in her spare time.
News junkies,
yeah. Yeah, exactly. So they're like, actually, being a big insider has no particular benefit. What they found, which I love, because they ran it in teams. They were like, teams are more effective than individuals at predicting because 100%. You counter each other's biases. So the University of Melbourne put forward a team a few years ago, and they came second in the world, which was really impressive. Their big insight, and this has been kind of checked out a few times, is they were like, the number one worst, like you want the biggest variety of minds on your team as possible, the most diverse group of personalities, because they will counter each other's biases. The worst thing you can have is a team of white men over the age of 50, because they will never accept that they're wrong. the most effective people to have in a team are women under the age of 35, because they are always, they're like, as a group, they're probably some of the most self-critical people out there. And being self-critical apparently is like the skill that you need.
I've nailed it then. Great. I was waiting for you to say the age, like, come on. All right, we're good.
Yeah, and then obviously probably no surprises, but that tournament ran for a couple of years, and then very quickly the CIA started sponsoring it in a big way. So if you take part in that one, you might get recruited. Who knows?
What was the stat? Like the initial predictions, this is I think pre-CIA coming on, I'm not 100% sure, but the accuracy level was like 30% higher than what the CIA could predict themselves,
100%.
basically. So they went, we want that,
Yep.
and just, signed on. But yeah, it's cool.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
So I guess the kind of final thing that we wanted to get into was, our own predictions for where we're kind of heading, and what sort of, what we've been imagining for Australia in the future, in the next little while. And also what we've been imagining, recent predictions that we made, or things that we've kind of been thinking about that we may or may not have gotten right.
Maybe let's start with wrong predictions first. I like that.
Okay, great.
Because COVID kind of changed everything. I don't think it completely threw everything in the bin from beforehand, but it's definitely accelerated some trends and decelerated others. And so things have either happened a lot more quickly or kind of had the pause button pushed on them. But the one I was saying to these guys earlier was I used to walk down the street all the time, and I'd sort of come from like working in sort of publishing and campaigns and using insights in that way. And I would always see QR codes everywhere. And I'm like, when are they going to give the QR codes a break? They do nothing. They are ridiculous. And then look where we are now. So there you go. That was my wrong prediction, is that QR codes obsolete. They are now literally the way that the world functions. So that's me.
I think mine was, I was mentioning before, back on music. I think maybe 10 years ago, a lot of people were talking about arriving at a sort of singularity of music genres. And while, yes, I would agree that maybe mainstream pop does have this sense that it's kind of just like taken, just kind of like, Frankenstein's monster, taken stuff from every genre that's ever existed before and distilled it into this kind of, mono sound. I think as you pointed out before, there's actually more variation and more sort of like subcultures and more subgenres than ever before. And I think a lot of that is in direct response to that. And a part of that simply being that people being able to access a type of genre of music or access a fan base, a community that they feel a part of, is now so much easier than ever before. It means that all of these different genres can actually exist and thrive and subsist on their own right because they have the people, because they have the fan base for it. So that was one I was wrong about. And I'm very glad of.
Yeah, great. You had some quite concrete ones, right? When COVID hit, you like fully wrote down what you thought was going to happen.
Yeah, this was my activity when the office kind of closed on the 15th of March. I was in London, stuck in London last year. I'm not sure when things actually locked down here fully, but in London, the big lockdown announcement was March 15th. So we left the office and basically the kind of streets were deserted. But my colleagues and I spent the afternoon writing a list of predictions for like 1 year from now. We opened them just the other day and had a look and and sort of checked how we'd gone. And I was terrible. If this kind of like invalidates my being up here.
I can't wait for this.
So one that I was really sure of or confident about that I was completely wrong on was about North Korea. So we work a lot with a group in the Philippines, and a few years ago we'd been taken over to Korea for this festival that's all about, in Seoul, which is all about Korean reunification. So basically, South Korea is kind of operating on the assumption that at some point North Korea, the regime will collapse and the two countries will have to reunify, and South Korea will have to absorb 25 million people into its workforce who are presumably not trained in any useful job skills and probably starving and probably traumatized and etc. So they're figuring out how to do that, and they're bringing in these consultants from Germany to talk about German reunification all the time. And I really thought that the pandemic would be the thing that would knock away the struts for the North Korean regime. I thought, how can they kind of maintain any sort of validation when there's a pandemic that they are in no way, haven't got the healthcare system to fight. That regime is stronger as of this week than it's ever been pretty much in our lifetimes, because turns out they were very well equipped to shut the borders and be completely isolated.
That would make sense.
Yeah, sort of depressing, but they were probably among the countries that were more able to just sort of lock the doors and even the things that used to happen pretty regularly, like South Korean activists usually launch balloons with little thumb drives on them over the demilitarized zone, so that with like kind of illegal media and so on for North Koreans to get. And those balloons haven't been flying because South Korea's been in lockdown, and the North Korean guards seem to have been charged with shooting people on sight.
Sure.
The other one, which I was very wrong about too, I was like, well, if no one can see each other, breath mints, sales will go way down.
What?
Yeah, I was like, well, why would you need breath mints if we're not actually going to be allowed to be in the same room as other people? I hadn't glommed on that when you've got a mask on, you can really smell your own breath.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
Yep. Interesting.
Remarkable.
Yeah, no one could have predicted the sweatpants kind of revolution either. It's really kind of thrown the fashion industry into whole disarray. It's just a complete other conversation. But yeah.
Where is the fashion industry now, kind of post-COVID?
I mean, there's a whole separate sort of area of trend forecasting that exists in the fashion space. There are a few like massive players that operate there, and you know, predicting colours and styles and fabrics 2 years into the future and that sort of thing. So definitely not my area of expertise, obviously. But yeah, I guess like the e-commerce kind of sales have shot way up, and the ones that were already selling, like the kind of, the athleisure, the activewear, the home style kind of stuff, the comfort dressing, and that style is sort of now carrying on to, now that we're entering back into our day-to-day lives. That's
Just this morning, we're actually on at the same time as the Oscars. They're happening right now. And just this morning, I was looking at some of the red carpet coverage, and a lot of the gowns, and especially the men's suits, are all much boxier, much baggier. People are wearing sneakers, and everyone's sort of attributing it to lockdown fashion, influencing what you might say is kind of like the pinnacle of, of style, which is the Oscars
lo-fi
red carpet.
fashion, very natural beauty and makeup regimes as well. So we work a lot in the beauty space, and having a lot more of an intersection between generally like health, wellness, and the way that we look as well is kind of where we're seeing that heading in broad strokes. But yeah,
there's something really kind of interesting related to that I wanted to ask, which is that you're kind of working in the commercial and private space, which I find really fascinating. So we. In one way, the reason that we started doing this work was with a kind of political intention. And it's because the future and future forecasting has traditionally been the province of big government, big tech, private companies. So I'm wondering you were sort of saying, we were kind of asking that question backstage, who owns the future? And you were feeling like maybe the power is shifting away from big companies, or...
I think it's, well, at the moment we've kind of got three players. We've got obviously tech companies that own a lot of our data, and data's the new oil, as they say. So until we can, conjure up a way or a movement where we can gain back control over our own data and the things that we see and how that's used for us and against us, the power is kind of stacked in that direction, I would say. Governments are becoming... more and more sort of surveillance culture oriented. I think there's a bit of a push to sort of reclaim some lost power. People are losing trust with them, and so now there's this kind of push-pull relationship between governments and people, particularly in the Western world. And then there's this sort of inverted power triangle where previously institutions and brands and companies and governments could sort of just lay down the law and the people would follow. But now, because obviously social media and digital communities and digital empowerment that comes with that, we've realised our power in numbers. We can sort of have a two-way dialogue with brands, with governments. There's ways to really easily organise behind causes that we care about as a community, as a society. So we've also had more power than ever before. I think it's more just about educating, particularly when it comes to data privacy, the way our data is used for and against us. I think that's the next big conversation there in how that can, how it disempowers us now, and it can potentially stand to empower us later as well. But it's an education piece as much as anything else.
But do you feel that people are kind of taking that power, or aware of that power? Or is that something that is a kind of trend you're forecasting for the future?
I think younger generations are growing up more aware of that power. I think people who haven't grown up constantly connected may have, a little bit of, it may still be sort of an adjustment period. But I think, we are becoming increasingly aware of the power that we have when we organise, behind causes based on our values. So, yeah.
I really hope you're right. And
me too.
And one of my one of the more cynical fears that I have is, for future forecasting, the idea of creating multiple scenarios kind of has this really concrete history, and it starts with Shell in the 70s. Very famously, Shell did this series of forecasting exercises where they imagined what what the future might look like in those four, this gesture again, those four different possible futures for oil availability. And one of the scenarios was actually turned out to be very similar to what happened with the kind of OPEC oil crisis in the mid-70s. Shell rode that better than anyone, any other company. They kind of made out like bandits during that time. So they've since then been kind of known as the grandparents of that kind of forecasting practice. And to my mind, that idea of like thinking about the future in that way, I haven't seen it filter down from governments and think tanks and that sort of practice into the general public. It still seems like it's very out of people's comfort zones to think about the future in that way. But maybe you're seeing it differently.
Yeah, I mean, I think, COVID has definitely spurred on a renewed interest or a heightened interest in being able to plan and prepare for the future. And so doing the kind of work that we do, it's a really interesting time to be doing that. Obviously, a lot of things have changed. A lot of things have accelerated, decelerated. Trends have kind of changed trajectory a bit, and a lot of brands are interested in what's next. So there's that element of it. I think that there are applications of scenario planning and trends forecasting that can be used to sort of map our own lives. But I mean, in our sort of day to day, we've never really seen as much interest as we are right now in doing that in a commercial sense. So helping to brands ride the choppy seas of change is essentially what that's all about.
That actually, we've got just under 5 minutes left, so I was going to say that actually segues quite nicely to an audience question that we had that was submitted online before the event. The first one that Pia asked was, do you think there should be an academic course in futurism or trend forecasting? And does that
100%.
speak to... Yeah?
It's great. I think there absolutely should. I've had a little bit of a look at this, and it's, there's not many sort of options like locally, but I think starting out with, like tools like we were mentioning before, like the Future Today Institute and stuff like that, and seeing, just getting into the practice of starting to think about things in this way. You can also look on, sites like Skillshare and, into online tutorials and stuff, and just look for, how different practitioners tackle scenario planning or trend forecasting. There's plenty of information online, but I think people could definitely benefit from having a course. Whether that looks like a traditional uni course, I think that that's another thing that we might see change quite soon, or whether it's something we can do online and it's a bit more flexible or whatever. Do
you have any tips for people kind of coming into this space? Anything that you wish you'd known when you started at forecasting?
Oh God, how did I even get into this space? No, I mean, a lot of it comes from, just reading a lot, just keeping, you'd have to have sort of a passion for culture and a curiosity about culture and trends and what that means in the greater sort of, behavioural sense or societal sense. If you've got that curiosity, I would say it's, and I'm sure you guys would agree as well when it comes to creative practice, that is what would usually drive something like what you guys are doing.
Yeah, what would be your tips for someone stepping into the kind of the world of making futures into stories?
Gosh, I guess, like, if you were to imagine a degree in it or something, I guess it's kind of like a combination of like data analysis, science communication, all these sorts of different tools. Advice for getting into futures. Just, just be that housewife in Kansas, I suppose.
Yep.
Really just like engage and actually learn as much as humanly possible, because that's just, the data is kind of all around you. And it's just about finding the right way to interpret it and synthesize it, and then having the imagination to do something with it.
Yeah, and having beginning with a specialism that interests you. So I began as sort of more like data and quant, and now it's more, signs and trends and semio. So it sort of can change over time. The career we're going to be working in 10 years probably doesn't exist yet either.
Yeah,
so there you go.
This is true.
We had a couple of audience questions, I think, before we wrap up in the next.
Yeah, the next one was, how do you establish an audience's trust in the authenticity of data?
Ooh, that's a good one. I think there is there's a lot of data flying around. There's a lot of bad data. I guess from my perspective, it would be just being as transparent as possible in like how the data was sourced, how it is being used, how decisions are being made off the back of it, and then being able to, I guess, like correlate what you've seen in your own research with other existing sort of reportage out there. Particularly, like there's a million trend agencies, there's government reports, there's a lot of publicly available, very trustworthy data as well. So yeah, I guess transparency is kind of the key thing there.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that one yourself?
I think it can be very, very tempting just to like name drop the sort of some established organization or institution, like, oh, this is from the this is a Defence Force report, this is from the IPCC. But I think it's actually changing, and people are much more willing to believe and trust possibly crowdsourced data, especially when it's en masse. You're not going to pay attention to one single tweet and be like, this is the truth. But if there's a billion people tweeting the same thing, then I don't think you can really deny the authenticity or the value of it.
Yep, exactly.
Did you have something to finish with, David, or do you want a last question?
Yeah, I just felt like I wanted to share this because a really lovely story in the kind of future space happened last year, and it's a really, I think, kind of positive and lovely thing. So it just really moved me when I read it. But in southwest Victoria, near Macarthur, there's a place called Budgebim, which is on Gunditj Mara land, and it was the site of an old aquaculture system. So from about 6,000 years ago, Indigenous people there, the Gunditj Mara people, began building this set of what is basically a system of eel traps. So they moved hundreds of tons of basalt to create this kind of system of rocks and weirs that essentially farmed eels and kind of did it all by itself. So it let little eels get away and kind of go, but it trapped bigger mature eels in these pools where they could be harvested. So it's kind of sustainable farming system. Like, it's been described as like kind of one of the earliest takeaways in the world. And it'd been running for thousands of years. Like, there's a couple of these ancient aquaculture systems in Australia, but this one had been running for thousands of years, and it was dormant since European colonization. The records are kind of patchy, but it hasn't been used or touched or even really understood or seen. The fires at the end of 2019, beginning of last year, actually cleared a lot of the vegetation and revealed this huge system again that people hadn't seen or had barely even known was there. And then the floods, the rains that came after the fires, started running through the course, and the thing just started up again and started working.
That's amazing.
This 6,000-year-old piece of technology, which is still working.
So cool.
So I feel like, as far as kind of futures looking, it doesn't get more far forward than that. This is a 6,000-year-old piece of tech from older than the pyramids, which is right now just churning away, doing its thing.
Wow, that's amazing.
Thank you so much. Thanks very much, guys, for being here.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you heaps, Stephanie. Thank you, Jordan.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks,
And
Wheeler Centre and Melbourne Knowledge Week.
It's the first day of Melbourne Knowledge Week, so get out and see some stuff. Our show's running Wednesday, Thursday, Friday night at the Meat Market. Thanks for coming, and thanks to everyone at home as well.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and around the world.